Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, those assembled here in Montreal, as well as those of us who are joining us online. Welcome to the opening press conference of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, taking place here in Montreal, Canada. I'm David Ainsworth, the Head of Communications for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and I will be your moderator for today's conference. Today, we have a distinguished panel to introduce us to the issues at the conference. I will introduce them in just a moment. For this conference, they will each deliver short remarks of about 3 minutes each, and then we will have a short question and answer period. Note, during the question and answer period, to manage interpretation and translation, we have some questions already directed towards the COP15 presidency, so we can manage some of the interpretation matters. So first of all, let me introduce the panelists that are beside me. I will introduce them to my immediate right and continue. So first we have His Excellency Stephen Guilbeault, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, who's representing the host of us here in Canada. Beside him, I have the COP15 President, Huang Rongqiu, who is the Minister of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China. Beside Mr. Rongqiu, I have Elizabeth Maruma Emrema, the Executive Secretary to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we're very pleased to have with us Inger Anderson, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. So we'll begin with remarks. We will have interpretation via the headsets in English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin or Chinese. So I will begin by asking COP15 President Mr. Rongqiu to deliver his remarks. Minister, the floor is yours.
Distinguished friends from the press, a very good morning to you. First of all, please allow me to welcome all of the friends of the press to be here for the second phase of the COP15. And as I know that you are all important driving force of the COP15. So as the host country, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you, and I hope you a good stay during the conference in Montreal. Today, we representatives of various parties and stakeholders from across the world, regardless of the distance or how big or small our countries are, race or color, have overcome the difficulties to gather in Montreal with the sole aim of reversing the global biological diversity loss at an earlier date, which is the fundamental purpose of our gathering today. Biological diversity is the lifeline of the life community on the planet and is also the bedrock on which human beings live and thrive. We say that prosperity of ecology leads to prosperity of the civilization, while decline of which leads to the decline of the civilization. However, the ecosystem of our Earth is facing an unprecedented crisis. According to the assessment of IPBES 2019, that human activities have impacted 75% of the land environment and 66% of the marine environment, and there has been a loss of more than 85% of the wetlands, and a quarter of the world species are threatened with extinction. And according to the IUCN 2020, that 41% of the amphibians and 26% of the mammals and 14% of the birds are being threatened. And this situation of biodiversity would continue to deteriorate. So at this critical moment, we are standing here again together at the crossroads of biodiversity conservation. I believe that you all feel the same with me, that we are all eager to take urgent actions to identify correct paths and effective solutions with our courage and wisdom so as to come up with a solution to tackle the challenges of the global biodiversity crisis and reverse the loss of biological diversity as early as possible. Since China has been the host country of COP15, we have overcome the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have pushed forward the COP15 conference with the highest political will and strongest action in response. So in September 2020, President Xi Jinping attended the United Nations Biodiversity Summit, expressing the steadfast support of China's government for the COP15 of CBD and our sincere welcome to the efforts from the international community. In last October, during the COP15 Phase 1, President Xi Jinping and 8 national leaders and Secretary General of the UN have delivered a keynote speeches at the summit, which also adopted the Kunming Declaration, laying a solid foundation for the second phase of the conference. In June this year, with the consultations between the Chinese government, the Secretariat of the Convention, and the Canadian government, we have decided together to hold the second phase of the conference in Montreal. That was absolutely a very difficult decision to be made. And the relocation of the venue was very hard for China, but at the same time, it also demonstrates our firm resolution of the Chinese government to promote the governance process of global biodiversity. China, as the chair of the COP15, we will continue to spare no effort to playing its leadership role to promote and coordinate all parties to try to reach a consensus and adopt the post-2020 biodiversity conservation framework at the second phase of the meeting. We will try to bridge the gaps between all parties, and I would like to especially thank the Canadian government for its great support in hosting the second phase of the conference, and also the Secretariat for their enormous work they have done, and the members of the presidency, and all of the stakeholders and all parties. It is exactly with your efforts and support that we could overcome the hardships and all the challenges ultimately and be here to witness this historic moment of the second phase of the COP15 conference. Ladies and gentlemen, our agenda and the preparations of the work are all in place, with parties demonstrating their strong will to take the framework to the next level. We're very much looking forward to it, and so is the world. We are ready for it, and let's do it. So let's join in hands, unite as one, and make joint efforts to write a new chapter of global biodiversity preservation and promote the building of a community of the life on earth and build a beautiful home for all. Thank you.
The COP15 president. Now to introduce His Excellency Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, to deliver remarks to the conference. Minister Guilbeault.
Merci beaucoup, David. Bonjour, bienvenue, good morning. Je suis très fier de vous accueillir dans la...
Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon. I'm proud to welcome you in the city where I live, Montreal, in the beautiful province of Quebec, and of course in our beautiful country that is Canada. We'd like to highlight the historic presence of the Mohawk, Algonquin, Huron, Wendat, and Abenaki nations in the Greater Montreal area and on the territory of the city of Montreal where we are today. The protection of nature and the effort we must make have never been as pivotal as today. With 1 million species threatened with extinction worldwide, COP15 is the meeting of a generation in order to work together to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Providing a future in which our societies develop in harmony with nature is the mission that we are entrusted with. The survival of our human species depends on this. Indeed, we are interrelated and interdependent with all life on Earth, and the biodiversity crisis we face requires the same level of effort and action as the climate crisis, and there's no time to lose. When we conserve and restore forests and wetlands, we support nature, and in turn, nature supports us. Through carbon sequestration, when cleaning our water and air, we protect ourselves from disasters and ensure rich and vibrant ecosystems to sustain all life on Earth. These are some of the reasons why Canada stepped forward to host COP15 when the UN requested us to do so. This conference couldn't wait any longer. Time is running out. We must act now.
Because we know Canada matters and has an important contribution to make. Globally, our country is home to 20% of the world's fresh water, 24% of the wetlands, and 25% of temperate rainforests, as well as 33% of the remaining boreal forest. We're a big country with big ambitions, and our government has been taking big actions. More than $5 billion committed to nature action, with two largest budgetary commitments in Canada's history coming since 2018. We've committed as a country to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. We're working in full partnership with Indigenous peoples as well as provinces and territories. We recognize our privilege and our responsibility as a country. That is why we've committed 20% of our $5.3 billion for international climate finance to support nature-based solutions abroad. It is why we've committed to address harmful subsidies, and we expect to have more to say on international finance as well as Indigenous-led conservation very soon. Through COP15, we will share Canada's nature ambitions with the world. What does that mean? First, let's all commit to halting and reversing the loss of nature. Second, we're seeking a global commitment to conserve at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030, which scientific research shows is the minimum necessary to address the biodiversity and climate crises. Third, we need to mobilize resources to achieve this from governments, private sector, philanthropy, and multilateral institutions. And we must do all this in full partnership with Indigenous peoples. As a host country, Canada is determined to support the Secretariat, the Chinese presidency, and all countries present here in Montreal for a successful outcome. Les 2 prochaines semaines ne seront pas faciles. Le chemin
The next 2 weeks will not be easy. The road to success is full of pitfalls, and we'll have to reconcile sometimes very different points of view and positions. However, whether we like it or not, we are all united by the deep connection to nature on which our survival on this planet depends. Canada is deeply committed to protecting its rich biodiversity, and Canada wants to be a constant partner so that together, at the end of these 2 weeks of collaboration, we can leave to the world an ambitious new global diversity framework. Thank you all, and we wish you a great conference.
Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, dear Minister.
From Inger Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Inger, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, and distinguished members of the press. Let me start by thanking the People's Republic of China for the leadership and the presidency of this COP. And let me also thank the Government of Canada, the seat of the CBD Secretariat, for their gracious extension to hosting COP 15.2. And in bringing us together, these two, at this crucial moment, a moment in which we need to agree on a plan to secure the very life support system for Earth. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has said, where we need to agree to make peace with nature. Because we can't afford to continue thrashing a path through the fragile web of nature and biodiversity to clear the way for human development. Species and ecosystems and the benefits that they provide, upon which we all depend, are degrading and dying slowly. And the loss and degradation of biodiversity comes at a cost that we measure not in dollars, but in livelihoods, in hunger, in disease, in vulnerability, in well-being, and yes, in deaths. We did this to ourselves. As the UN Secretary General has said yesterday, we are committing suicide by proxy. But this COP is our chance to start protecting and repairing the web of life. At this meeting, we need to see an ambitious and effective post-2020 global biodiversity framework with clear targets and benchmarks. A framework that faces down the 5 horsemen of the nature apocalypse defined by IPBES: changing land and sea use, overexploitation of species, climate change, pollution and invasive and non-native species. That deal with the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss, including harmful subsidies, misdirected investments, and unsustainable consumption and production. A deal that delivers for everyone, everywhere: indigenous people, local communities, urban population, those whose livelihoods depend directly on sustainable use of nature. A deal that helps address the wider triple planetary crisis of climate change, of nature and biodiversity loss, and of pollution and waste. A deal that recognizes sovereign and traditional rights and the wider values of biodiversity. A deal that ensures equitable sharing of the benefits from uses of genetic diversity and resources, whether through digital sequencing, information, or otherwise. And so, with agreement on the plan, it'll need to be delivered in full and urgently and across all of society. And that means agreeing here at this COP on sufficient resources and on ensuring greater transparency and progress that must be made in implementation. We have but a few days to act decisively and with principle. And action must be bold, not bracketed, so that we can get this deal done. We got an extra 2 years from the scourge of COVID. Let us not squander that. Rather, let us make sure that we deliver and deliver for people and for planet. Because once adopted, the global biodiversity framework will serve as a plan to conserve, to sustainably use, and to rebuild the web of life. The negotiations here at this COP must succeed. If the web of life fails, we all fail with it. But if we shore up and make it stronger, it will carry the full weight of humanity for centuries to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Executive Director. And our final speaker before we start the questions is Elizabeth Maruma Emrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Greetings to you all, and thanks for being here. Let me begin first by thanking our President, Minister Roinchu, for the leadership, guidance throughout this process for preparing for this COP. To Minister Gulbo for stepping in, the people of Canada, particularly here in Montreal, at short notice. And here we are, splendid venue, where we have the entire, or what it takes to have a peaceful, good place, good venue for you negotiators and other negotiators to give us what has brought us all to this beautiful city of Montreal. We are not here just for just a normal UN Biodiversity Conference. This is a completely different conference, a historic one. It has not happened in the 30 years of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and yet there is still far too much at stake to see happening in the next 2 weeks through that lens of what brought us all here. It has already been underlined that biodiversity underpins our very existence on this planet. It is the food we eat, the water we need, we use, we drink, the clean air we want to breathe, the goods and services, the health in terms of medicines, the climate regulation, and the list goes on. And scientists have all told us, despite all these benefits, yet our own human activities have already altered over 97% of the ecosystems worldwide today. We've been reminded just now, over 1 million species going to extinction within this century. The loss of biodiversity has never reached the rate it is in the history of humankind. Even the recent WWF Living Planet report told us out of the monitored wildlife population, since 1970, 69% have completely dropped. These are not simple numbers. And we know half of the global GDP is dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services it provides. And therefore, the global economy is at risk by the loss of biodiversity by that over 50%. We have the next 2 weeks over 196 parties here in Montreal, parties to the convention, who will be negotiating but have the responsibility to agree and adopt an international policy framework, which we call now Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will provide that roadmap of repairing our human relationship with the natural environment. We have goals for this conference. The goals which include, we need to raise ambition for nature and ensuring a whole of government, a whole of society implementation of the new global plan, which will put nature on a path to recovery by 2030 and humanity on a path to its globally agreed long-term vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. The time when biodiversity will be well managed, conserved, restored, sustainably used, and ensuring the benefits arising from it are fairly and equitably distributed. We need also to underline the intrinsic link and connection between climate change and biodiversity loss or nature loss. So, meeting the global biodiversity framework goals will equally contribute to the climate agenda, while the full delivery of the Paris Agreement on climate change is needed to ensure the global biodiversity framework also succeeds. We need to ensure that the commitments, or we need to match the commitments with the accountable actions and resources required to implement the framework. We need to engage public, private, philanthropy sectors to close by 2030 the biodiversity finance gap, currently estimated at around $700 billion per year. We need them to align trillions of dollars in global spending with goals for biodiversity and ensure that biodiversity is mainstreamed and considered in economic decisions. It has been mentioned by ministers here. We need to reform, repurpose, redirect harmful subsidies to biodiversity into positive biodiversity activities. So over the next few days, over the last few days, 3 days to yesterday, the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework delegates had worked hard and tirelessly. Some progress has been made, but not so much as needed or expected. And I have personally to admit that I don't feel that the delegates went as far as we had expected. But progress has been made, and that positive aspect is what we need to carry forward. And as they move into now the second part of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, COP15, they need to focus on the end goal, the final result, that is to have an ambitious, realistic, achievable, actionable global biodiversity framework that is easy to communicate, rooted in science, strong enough to put us really on a path to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. The job of the parties now is to ensure that this focus is not lost. They need to refine the text, seek to compromise, and take us on this journey to a future of living in harmony with nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to our panelists for their remarks. We'll now turn to the period of questions. I'll ask the room attendants to prepare some microphones to hand out to the questions that will be asked. I would like to let everybody know we will attempt to have a balance of questions to all the panelists so that we can make sure they've all got an opportunity to express their remarks. So I will first start a question to the COP15 president. I believe I have a colleague in the second row here. Can you pass the microphone to him and you introduce yourself, please?
您好，谢谢，新华社记者，请问作为 COP15的主席国，中
As a COP president, what has China done to promote COP15 conference? What results has been achieved? What are your expectations for the second part of this meeting? Thank you. Wei Xin from Xinhua News Agency.
刚才我在开场致辞中对中
For your question, as I talk about the progress of promoting the COP15, I have mentioned during my remark. Taking this opportunity, just want to complement a few points. The first one is on a high-level meeting as a presidency host country. I have repeatedly emphasized that China has the biggest determination and action to promote the biodiversity conference and COP15. We talk about what President Xi has expressed at the UN Biodiversity Conference during 2020 and 2021. And especially, he has gave a very important remark regarding COP15. He has expressed our country's determination on the biodiversity. Last month at the Bali for the G20 summit, during the summit, we have a declaration being made. I believe a lot of media friends has heard and have seen. We have a big chapter which mention about the governance and the conservation of biodiversity, also including what remarks being made by President Xi from People's Republic of China and other stakeholders from other countries at the G20 summit. For the second phase of COP15, we are talking about ambition and actionable, achievable, and also post-2020 biodiversity conference framework. For recent years, President Xi has closely worked together with high meeting with UK and countries from Europe, repeatedly talk about the governance regarding the biodiversity.
And for the past year, after the Phase 1 conference, in playing its leadership and coordinating all parties to settle disputes and bridging the gaps and reaching consensus, China has played a critical role. And this would include that the July this year in UN Sustainable High-Level Summit and also the G20 Summit on ecological and environmental changes in Bali Island. So also in COP27 and other number of international summits, we have used this as a leverage to keep our communication as the driver for the COP15 program. And we have kept our communication among the parties and stakeholders and trying to reach the consensus. And over the past year, together with the Secretariat, we have also held almost 40 meetings together with the Secretariat. And this is very rare just for the past year, so over 40 meetings. And there are also more than 100 meetings, including seminars and roundtables that are being held for the past year to keep our communication going and provide the channel for communication. So that's what we have done in playing our leadership role. And last note would be that in playing our role in the organizations, social organizations, and the firms, in 2018, the COP14, the Chinese government and Egyptian government and our secretariat, we have initiated an action plan. And this action plan involves many commitments of the social organizations and firms, and there are 10% that are come from Chinese firms and entrepreneurs. And our organizations and entrepreneurs have also made the commitment that in the next decade or so, that they would provide 8.5 billion to promoting the 100,000 square meters of soil management and environmental governance. So that are the commitments that we have done. And in regards to the next step for the next stage, for the phase 2, well, let me share that it is my expectation that all parties and stakeholders would reach consensus in our negotiations in the phase 2, which will be focusing very much on the negotiation and the talks. So it is my hope that all parties and stakeholders would demonstrate their will and flexibility in the aim of reaching the consensus and ultimately reach to promote our framework. Thank you.
I want to note that we have people at the microphones. I will note that we wish to have a balance of questions. So for the first microphone, I would ask if you have a question to be directed to another one of the panelists and not the COP15 president. Is that the case?
Oui.
OK, allez-y, posez votre question.
Donc, bonjour, Éric Pierre-Champagne du quotidien La.
My question is for Mr. Guilbeault. This COP is very particular in the sense that it is Canada that hosts and the presidency is of China. How do you manage this, and how do you underline the presidents of of China? How do you see your role as Canada in this context? And if you have discussions with your Chinese partner in this sense?
Thank you for this question. Of course, when the UN approached us to be the host of this conference, it was in the framework of a discussion that took place within the so-called bureau. So it's the equivalent of the governing board or of the convention, along with the participation of China. So that's a joint decision. Holding this conference is a joint decision. Holding it in Canada, having Canada as a host country. So as I said previously, we want to play a very proactive role as a host country, while there is the Chinese presidency and with the participation of all the countries here, so that the outcome of the conference is a success. As you know, Canada is an active member of the High Ambition Coalition, and today there are more than 120 countries that are part of this coalition. So as it was reminded by Minister Ronqiu and Ms. Maruma and Ms. Anderson, there is a genuine key momentum, and Canada wants to keep on contributing to this momentum.
So I note that we have other questions on the floor for others. I recognize Patrick Greenfield from The Guardian. Hopefully your question is to one of the other panelists who hasn't spoken yet. Can we get a microphone to Patrick Greenfield here? Second side here, third row. Thank you very much. It's okay, Patrick, there's one coming to you. He has two now. The embarrassment of riches.
Executive Secretary, it's fantastic to finally be here at COP15. I wanted to ask about the overlap with climate that you've talked about so much. Is it also the case that over the next 2 weeks, 1.5 degrees is on the line?
Thank you very much. I will say a few words and hope you will permit also Inga to contribute on that. One, we need to underline the direct connection now between climate change and biodiversity. And one of the draft targets in the framework is on contributing to climate change. But it's not just that one target which mentions climate change. Virtually the success of the framework, all of the targets will have an impact on climate change. If we look at the recent disasters, be it floods, drought, heat waves, wildfires, yes, we always say it's because of climate change, but where are these disasters happening? They all happen on the ecosystem, on biodiversity. And clearly, unless we protect and restore that biodiversity, climate warming will continue to rise, and we might fail to reach the 1.5 degrees. Not surprising that scientists have told us 30% of climate mitigation is expected to come from biodiversity conservation. And climate community looking at nature, biodiversity based solutions to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And therefore that discussion is on the table. Thank you. But Inga?
Maybe just to add, I mean, it's obvious that that mangrove, that coastal forest, that estuary, that coral reef will break the waves, will protect the people, will ensure that the very lungs of nature can absorb the pressure that nature puts at us. So on the adaptation side, it's self-evident. And of course, on and the mitigation side is also self-evident. The more biomass we have, the more carbon we store, and that's a good thing for people and for the planet. There is, and IPBES has made this very clear in identifying these 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, a dimension directly contributed by climate change to species loss, right? I always have to take a run at this word, but the phenology of the mismatches as some species migrate based on heat and other hatch based on light, etc., and humidity. So those mismatches are, of course, more and more apparent the more we are seeing climatic variability. I think the Secretary General has stressed again and again the indivisibility of the Rio Conventions, including, therefore, also the Desertification Convention that deals with land, productivity, etc. And that becomes very clear. And having just come here from Uruguay, where we are engaging in the talks around plastics, we need to understand that pollution is also a driver of biodiversity loss. So the whole system is interconnected. And I think that that's very much on the mind of negotiators here, which is why the targets are as encompassing as they are, because to recognize this without duplicating in other conventions and agreements.
David, can I briefly? Thank you. One might argue, and I guess I am, that our 1.5 is 30 by 30, is protecting 30% of lands and oceans by 2030, is the biodiversity equivalent of the 1.5 degrees on climate change. And I think that's one of our collective goals. I wish, and Canada wishes, for this to be one of our collective goals, as does the High Ambition Coalition for this conference. Thank you.
Excellent. So just a minute here, Solon. Etienne, is your question to, which panelist is your question to? I've got to get a balance here.
Ministre Guilbeault.
Certainement, allez-y.
Monsieur Guilbeault, donc...
Dear Minister, you just highlighted that Canada, as the host country, is a country that needs to lead by example with the 1.5 that would consist in protecting 30% of the areas, the land and sea areas. Would you protect the territories that are likely to be developed and not those in the north that have a huge impact on development? So I mean the risky territories in the south of the country. Of course, yes. Of course, yes. So that's your engagement. Because in the past, these were mostly the territories that were less interested in. But in fact, we have the engagement to create 15 urban parks, national urban parks, throughout the country, and of course including some virgin forests close from Montreal. There are not many of them left, but there are still some interesting protected areas. But in this against this backdrop, this would be more of a restoration of degraded areas more than the protection of some intact areas. But in terms of biodiversity, this is a very key value. But we need to do both things. Of course, we need to protect both in the north and the south of the territories, and that's our goal of 30 by 30. This goal is a quantitative goal, but I understand that your question also addresses the quantitative or qualitative aspect, and that's a criteria for the analysis in when we select the projects.
I will now take a question from the third row on this side here, the gentleman in the suit. Let's see here. Who's your question directed towards?
My question directed to the Secretary Murema.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm a reporter from the paper China, and my question to Mrs. Secretary is: you just mentioned this is a historical conference, and we know that the main agenda for this conference is to achieve the post-2020 framework. So, for those who are not very familiar with this framework, can you introduce us the significant meaning of this framework and why it is so important? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, we need to understand that under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the program of work is based on a 10-year plan. So we've finished what we are calling Biodiversity Strategic Plan with 20 IH biodiversity targets. Unfortunately, at global level, none of the 20 IH biodiversity targets were met or achieved. But we also know that good progress, some progress was made at national level in a number of countries. And when I say these targets were not met, that came also at the time, and especially through the IPBS report or Global Biodiversity Outlook Report 5, which shows us that not only that we have not achieved those targets globally, but the state of the planet is in a serious crisis. Crisis under climate change, crisis of pollution, crisis of the loss of biodiversity. And the scientists have underlined to us, this is our last chance to act. Otherwise, all of us will perish. And unfortunately, we have no planet B to go to, or there's no other planet to live with our future generation or the children. So that's the backdrop of why we are here. So if this is our last chance, this is the time to take action. This is what then is underlined under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework now, which is presented with a long-term vision, 2050, when the world will live in harmony with nature, with 4 goals, which basically 4 goals which will lead us to 2030, with currently about 22 draft targets, which provide that pathway to enable the world to reach, first to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And that will require actions to take place at all levels of the society, and that's why I mentioned we need whole of government. It's not the matter to be left to the ministries of environment alone, and this is one of the lessons we've learned from the failure of the IH biodiversity targets. Biodiversity, nature, environment is a cross-cutting issue. So we need everybody, and the framework will be framework for all. No one should be left behind. It's when I say framework for all, also taking into account the interests of stakeholders, indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth, the women. But also we are seeing the business, the financial institutions also on board. And all these different stakeholders can see themselves in the draft framework because they have specific actions to take to contribute to that effectiveness of the framework. What will be important after the framework is adopted is implementation. Yes, we can have a framework on paper, but that will be a useless paper unless it is turned into action on the ground. Action on the ground, which now will actually change the relationship, our human actions on nature, which have been the worst culprit, if I may use that word. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. I'll take a question from the microphone in the front. The woman in the blue shirt, please.
Hi, Elisa, Radio Canada. My question is for the Executive Secretary. You've mentioned that we need to see some compromise. This text needs to be refined. What kind of compromise would be acceptable in order to make that COP15 a success?
First, we need compromise on all targets, because unless all targets are implemented, we may not reach those the 2030 halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity. So one is to avoid the pick and choose, because they are all connected, they are all related. In terms of compromise also, the current draft still has a lot of brackets. So we need the negotiators to discuss and agree to remove those brackets. We know when you have over 190 countries sitting and negotiating, it's not easy to agree on a word which is common to all the countries. And this is where the give and take comes in. Flexibility, compromise, consensus. It doesn't mean at the end of the day, each country will get 100, 200% of what they would have wished to get, but at least agree to move with the consensus and be ready to contribute to the implementation without blocking that agreement or that compromise.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So I believe, I think,
Inga
sorry.
would like to add that.
Certainly, Inga, go ahead.
If I may just add, I mean, this is sort of a message beyond the press conference, but it's absolutely critical that all negotiators and all negotiating leads realize that it's down to the wire now, and it's time to come under the big tent. Corner solutions, they start early on in a negotiating process. It's normal, and we respect that. But we have a presidency that is determined to drive us to the end goal. And it's now time for everyone to move a little. And that moving a little becomes critical right now. Words that are being bandied about are actually very much similar. Let's just settle on some of these things. Because when the gavel goes down and the day is done, what will be remembered is not the complexity around a word. What would be remembered is the level of ambition and the implementation that followed. And that is what we need to aim for. And therefore, I ask that all negotiators now take courage. The heads of state have spoken. We heard that from His Excellency, the Minister, and in G20, in the General Assembly. They want this. Ministers have spoken very clearly. The two ministers actually hosted an informal ministerial on the sidelines of COP27. So it is time now to meet in the middle. And whilst we've been given 2 extra years for these negotiations, that was not a gift we wanted because of COVID, of course, we must not assume that this is now unending. It is ending, and it can entirely be done. We've seen it again and again in multilateral negotiations. So we very much encourage everyone to listen to the wise words from the Executive Secretary so that we can get this done.
Thank you very much. To continue this conversation, my apologies, I was texted a question from the China Daily for the COP15 president that follows exactly this line. So our colleagues from the China Daily who sent me this message. Okay, I'll read out the question because, Mr. Minister, I believe it fits this. The question is, what are the difficulties and challenges in the current negotiations? And more importantly, how will you exert your leadership to promote all parties to bridge differences, form concerted efforts, and push to reach the agreement of the post-2020 biodiversity conservation framework? To the President. Yeah.
Thank you for the question from the journalist. this is a very complicated question. Madame Anderson Ulma has also talked about it from one perspective through the negotiation. It's very complicated. Well, this is a very historical framework, as I said. We do have difficulties and challenges. It is normal. Despite we have 196 conference of parties, all the COP want to express and state their critical points. It is we have difficulties and challenges indeed. And what are those challenges you're asking? In my memory, we have several points. The first one, Madame Executive Director has talked about how to implement the 3 goals of the conventions. The convention talk about the protect conservation of the sustainability, how to seek for the balance between the 3. How do we see the ambition and the practicality from the framework? This is really a big challenge. So this is the first one we're concerning about. The second one is a very common question. To realize the 20 goals of the framework, we need sufficient resources and subsidies and funds. Now we have a big gap for the biodiversity governance. How do we manage the mechanism in a reasonable way to meet the goals? To meet the goals, the needs of the developing countries? This is a very distinctive question. The third one is a very technical question. It's about DSI. Even the progress of DSI, comparing with 1 year ago, we have a relatively big progress. But given the policy and technical issues, we do have a lot to be resolved. For example, the execution mechanism, the monitoring and the reviewing framework, etc. So going forward, we have a lot to be done. As a president, I believe there's challenges and difficulties. I fully understand. The negotiations really need to take a lot of concerted efforts. And on the third and fifth, we have the working group meeting held. The parties on an everyday basis, even the middle night, we have just finished the meeting, going back to the hotel to rest. The parties are very diligent. They pulled all the strings. As a China's saying goes, we spend all the efforts in advance, which is really cornerstone for the will lay a foundation for the effectiveness of COVID-15 conference. Going forward, how do we promote to resolve those issues, except those things being concerned by our presidency of COVID-15 and by Secretariat? We have 2 working groups, and under the framework of the mechanism of such meeting, besides those consultation and negotiation, taking the opportunity, I think we can further promote those negotiation. For instance, we have a high-level meeting. How do we make full use of the high-level meeting? So rely on the courage of the political leaders to achieve some of the key issues or consensus, because on the high level, the political leaders really will be on the same position to achieve the consensus. I think on the 15th, on the 17th, we will have the high level meetings to address those issues. For some of the difficult issues, we can take the opportunity to further address them. Secondly, we could utilize some of the practical and programmatic, like in a small meeting scale, but very small scale meeting, but we will have very high flexibility, like the coordination between ministers to address those issues to achieve a consensus in that type of meeting. Thirdly, among there, how to assure the stakeholders' participation, including NGO, private, public parties, and the indigenous population, a local community to come together to come to consensus. So during the meeting, we have a mechanism. We have to continuously to sum up and recap the progress, what kind of issues to be addressed, and what kind of adjustment, what kind of modification for the meetings in between. So that's what I can tell to propel the progress of the negotiation, achieve the final framework. Thank you.
Will unfortunately be our last question because the ministers and panelists have bilaterals after this. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Jayla Bernstein for CBC. My question is for Minister Guilbeault. I'm just wondering if you can speak, well, you mentioned that your hope is to share Canada's ambition for preserving biodiversity with the world. And I'm just wondering if you can square that hope to be a leader on the world stage with the fact that Canada has failed to meet previous biodiversity targets. And in fact, your Auditor General's office has said we're not on track to meet our goals for 2025 or 2030. So I'm just hoping you can speak to how you plan to square past failures with your plan to be a leader and a plan to get an agreement sealed by the end of the next 2 weeks.
I think we didn't achieve our targets before because we didn't give ourselves the means to do it. And frankly, what is true of Canada is true of what we're seeing internationally. And I think we in Canada and many of us here are working really hard to change this, both domestically and internationally. There were recent reports by the Canadian CPAWS, the Canadian Wilderness Society, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and I believe, was it Nature Canada or the Nature Conservancy, that shows how Canada can meet our 2025 and 2030 conservation goals. When we came into power in 2015, Canada wasn't even protecting 2% of its oceans and coastline. We're at 15% now. We did that in 7 years. So basically, in the next 7 years, we have to redo what we did over the past 7 years. I spoke about the record level investment we're making are certainly part of the solution. It's not just about money, but it is certainly in part about money. It's about the nature agreement we're developing with provinces and territories, where I'm hoping that in the coming days we will be able to announce real progress on this. So it's not just the federal government, but us working with provinces and territories in ways we've never done before, and obviously with Indigenous people as well. So I think we are trying to give ourselves the means to do this domestically, and this meeting is about giving ourselves collectively, internationally, the means to do it as well on the international scene.
Good, thank you very much. Our panelists have bilaterals, including with ministers and the Secretary General. So thank you to all our panelists for the press conference, and thank you to the journalists for joining us. So our panelists will file and will leave the green room. Journalists, you'll have another meeting, another press conference at WWF at 11 a.m. this morning. Thank you so much for our panelists. Thank you.